Good morning to everyone. I know we have a large and diverse audience here with a range of people, a range of interests, and a range of political positions. I know some people will be joining us, but we have an hour for this event, so we're going to begin promptly and run till about 10:30. My name is Geoff Thale. I'm the president of WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, and I'm really pleased to be able to host this webinar along with colleagues at Oxfam America, Oxfam International, at the Center for Democracy in the Americas, and at Cafe Cuban Americans for Engagement. There are a range of issues to talk about in Cuba, in U.S. policy toward Cuba. There's a range of issues about the economy, about human rights, about social justice. This particular topic today is focused on Oxfam's recently released report entitled Right to Live Without a Blockade, the Impact of U.S. Sanctions on the Cuban Population and on Women's Lives. It's an important and it's a timely topic. It's a topic clearly related to human rights. I think it's particularly important right now in the aftermath of the Trump administration and its tightening of sanctions in the context of the pandemic and its impact, worldwide, but in the United States, throughout Latin America, and in Cuba, to look at the daily life of the Cuban people, particularly to look at the lives of Cuban women who bear the biggest burden, I think, because of the residue of the continuing existence of patriarchal and machismo kind of structures, and what that means for people and what U.S. sanctions have meant. So I'm going to let all our panelists speak. We're really happy to have Elena Gentili, the director of Oxfam's office in Cuba, Connor Gorry, a journalist who's lived in Havana for 15 years, more than 15 years, and edits the MEDICC review, which looks at health and medical issues in Cuba, and María Isabel Alfonso, who is a professor, the chair of the Modern Languages program actually at St. Joseph College, and one of the founders of Cafe Cuban Americans for Engagement. So each of them is going to, I've got questions for each of them. Each of them will speak briefly about the report, and then depending on timing, we'll have time for questions and answers. But I'm really pleased to be able to begin with some opening remarks by Representative Jim McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts. Representative McGovern's the chair of the House Rules Committee, a longtime advocate for social justice and better U.S. relations in the hemisphere overall, longtime history on Central America in particular, and longtime engagement, and in fact, engagement from before he was a member of Congress, in improving U.S. relations and relations between the United States and Cuba. So let me turn to Representative McGovern for some opening remarks, and then we'll go to our panelists. So welcome, Representative McGovern, and thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, Geoff, and thank you for the kind introduction. And let me welcome and thank everyone who is joining us today to learn more about how sanctions affect the Cuban people and especially Cuban women. I believe that this report couldn't be more timely or more important. Among those who make and carry out U.S. policy, sanctions is a tool to punish, to censure, and to seek political economic advantage. More and more experts and analysts are viewing broad economic and sectoral sanctions as cruel and very crude tools that rarely harm the intended target, but mete out tremendous pain in the daily lives of ordinary people. U.S. sanctions against Cuba are a relic of the Cold War. In well over half a century, they have never achieved their stated purpose, either to remove the Cuban government or create a path for a defined set of elections and governance. During the last 2 years of the Obama administration, in large part due to pressure from people on this call and some members of Congress, we saw a loosening of sanctions. For the first time, we saw how much the United States could actually stand with the Cuban people, support them with opportunities for expression, innovation, and economic growth, and advance cooperation between our two governments and peoples in so many ways that were and still would be today to our mutual advantage. What the loosening of the sanctions allowed was for the people of the United States and the people of Cuba to interact and engage with one another and to explore all the possibilities between our two peoples, the very best form of diplomacy. When we impose sanctions, We don't talk about the suffering we cause others. We don't think in terms of the suffering we cause to the Cuban people. We don't think of their right to live without the hardships imposed by the embargo. So this report restores the human face of sanctions. Now, look, I'm not terribly optimistic that this Congress will all of a sudden vote to end the embargo, although we're going to try. But I'm hopeful that a new and stronger campaign can be built to demand that we do so. I hope that the Biden administration will soon act and terminate the executive orders and restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. I hope that the Biden administration will stand with the Cuban people and reinstate, at a very minimum, the Obama policies. But I have to be honest with you, I'm frustrated by how slow the State Department and White House have been with their policy review. While they twiddle their thumbs and argue over what to do, those bearing the cost are the Cuban people themselves. And each day Biden officials delay, they are responsible for people suffering in Cuba. Each day they fail to lift the restrictions on financing and travel, they punish Cuban American families and my own constituents. They can't send funds to Cuba. They can't travel to Cuba. Their relatives can't travel to the United States. They can't interact with Cubans, and they can't support Cuban innovation, their small businesses, and their social and cultural work, and certainly not with the ease and security that they did so in the past. So let me just finally say, as a United States congressman, I'm embarrassed by our policy toward Cuba. I'm trying to be kind in my analysis here, but I just think it's dumb, stupid, self-defeating, and it's cruel. And I don't think the American people support this. So we need to build the campaign. We need to build the pressure. We need to educate members of Congress. We need to open their eyes to the realities. And we need them to understand the terrible impacts of the status quo. So let me just say thank you, Oxfam. Thank you, WOLA. Thank you, CDA, for hosting today's event on this critical and timely report. And I will yield back my time.
Great. Thank you, Representative McGovern. And thank you for the leadership you've shown on this issue over the years. I should note for our audience that there is a Q&A section here. So if you have questions, please put them in there and we'll try and get to them. We actually got a question already for Representative McGovern, so I will pitch it briefly to you and then go on to our panel. The question asks about your sense of what the Biden administration is likely to do, but also in particular, tomorrow, the UN General Assembly will take up its annual vote on condemning the U.S. embargo and the impact that that's had on daily life in Cuba itself. At the end of the Obama administration, Samantha Power, who is today our USAID administrator and then our ambassador to the UN, led the UN, made a powerful speech about the embargo and led the US in abstaining for the first time on this resolution. Do you have a sense both what the United States might do and what, in your view, it ought to do on this?
Yeah, well, at a minimum, I hope they abstain. But to be totally honest with you, I don't have a clue what they're going to do. Some of us have contacted the administration directly. I mean, I've sent them a formal letter. We have been in contact with people over the State Department expressing our concern for them to reverse course as to where Trump was. We have not been given any indication of what they will do. But let's be honest. I mean, again, in this report, I think illustrates the fact the status quo is cruel. It's hurting people, we've been pursuing this policy for decades. It hasn't achieved any of the stated objectives. It's self-defeating. It is time for us to reverse course, and I hope that they will do that. If they don't, then all of us should be pretty loud in our condemnation of their maintaining the Trump policies. I don't quite frankly understand what the hell is taking so long, but we'll wait and see. I hope again at a minimum they will abstain. That would be a powerful signal that they're hopefully going to reverse course. But again, they haven't informed me, and I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, and I'm going to go to church and light a candle and hope they'll do the right thing.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I know you don't have a direct channel to the president on this topic. So thank you for your opinion.
I should tell you one thing. So when, many of us had pressed Obama to change his policy, when they decided to change their policy, the person who informed me of the change in policy was then Vice President Biden. And so, he went through in quite some detail with me, all the changes that were going to be made. And I thought he did so enthusiastically. So I'm hoping that President Biden will channel Vice President Biden and do the same thing now.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. That's a great introduction. Now let's turn to our panelists, and thank you. I don't know how much more time you have to be with us, Mr. McGovern, but let's turn to our panelists. What I'm going to do is try and ask a couple questions of each panelist, give them some 8 or 10 minutes to respond. And then if we have time at the end, we'll go to questions and answers. And please feel free to add those in the Q&A section, the bottom of the website. So let me start with Elena, who directs Oxfam's office in Cuba and has 15 years of experience as an international development professional. Elena, can you tell us a little bit about why Oxfam released this report now and kind of summarize what you see as its main conclusions?
Well, thank you very much, Geoff. Thank you everyone to join this space. In order to address this question, I would like, if possible, to share a very short video that has been made in the last couple of weeks that I think is fit very well to this question.
Great.
No?
Whoop, it may take us a minute to work through the technical issues to get this launched.
Well, so I just introduced you if you think a bit about the report, and then we can have a space as soon as the video is ready. Well, you know that it's not the first time for Oxfam to recognize how the US sanctions are a major obstacle for the exercise of the Cuban people's rights. But now, and why now? The Right to Live Without a Blockade report reveals the impact of nearly 6 decades of sanctions imposed by different and successive US governments on the Cuban population. So through our experience on the ground, what we wanted to achieve was the human dimension, presenting how people are actually suffering from these measures that are increasing and deepening the economic crisis. But again, why now? Because beside the 6 decades of coercive unilateral sanctions, we have seen how during the last period, during the Trump administration, these sanctions these measures have even increased, and the same ones are still in effect nowadays. During a global pandemic, in a time then where it's even more urgent to change the US policy towards Cuba and call for a normalization, right, between the two countries. But it's been exactly the opposite. So in fact, this call acquires even more greater relevance in the current context during a global health crisis, where the sanctions have not been reconsidered, on the contrary, have been reinforced. And when Oxfam, as an international co, is recognizing, as many of us, that the global health crisis is a common problem, so we should respond as a collective and a common solution. And we believe that removing the obstacles posed by the US sanctions against Cuba is and could be an effective response to the pandemic as well. So since about 3 decades, Oxfam is working since the 1993. Oxfam has been supporting multiple actors and national and local level, working with them in order to try building a more just, inclusive, and sustainable and sovereign community and society. But during these projects, during the implementation of our projects and experiences, we have been able to learn firsthand how and what the US policy on Cuba actually means, and finding the human faces, you know, the human stories behind these sanctions. And the report wants to collect and present these story and testimonies to the world, actually, and mainly to the US society. At the center of our work, there is the commitment to protect and promote women's rights and gender justice. That means providing processes and supporting processes of greater empowerment to develop their capacity and promote their projects and leadership in order to fully exercise their rights. However, what we have seen is that women in all the sectors, those sectors where are more recognized in Cuba as the health sector or the educational sector, but also in those sectors as the private sector, have been left unprotected with the intensification of the US measures and, of course, the pandemic, because of different reasons, due to the tangible and intangible impacts. Especially women have been experiencing the challenges of not being in contact with their families abroad, the challenges of not receiving enough funds due to the restrictions of the limitation of the remittances and so on. So the main findings of this paper are reached thanks to the evidences registered along all these years, almost 27 years of working on the ground in Cuba together with partners, and the need of looking at the impacts of the US blockade in Cuba with the differentiated impacts, with a rate-based approach, illustrating the reality of the Cuban people, because sometimes we don't talk enough about the reality and the daily life of Cuban people, and mostly Cuban women, providing a space for the Cuban women to speak out and demanding for a dignified life without the need of being resilient even to the US policy towards Cuba. And having an intersectional focus, which means to look at the different sectors and how the sanctions have impacted in all the sectors of the Cuban society and the life of people, including the private sector. So whenever we will be able to look at the video, I think it will be even more clear what I'm talking about, because it's one of the experiences you can read about in the paper. So Oxfam considers that the improvement of the living condition of the Cuban people has been limited across these 6 decades due to the unilateral measures. Even though we are fully aware that is not the only aspect that hinders the full development of Cubans and Cuban women, however, we call for the normalization of the relation between the US and Cuba, because doing so, we're sure that the 11 million people living on the island will have more opportunity to realize their dreams and to exercise their rights. So we, together with the local civil society and the international civil society, we call for and we encourage to undertake joint initiative to document the impact of the blockade on all sectors, and mostly on the sectors that each organization targets and work on, and especially the communities in Cuba facing the greatest social vulnerability. So I join, you know, what we were just talking about. Tomorrow is you know, the upcoming resolution in the United Nations General Assembly, and is a great opportunity for the new administration to open a space for the United States-Cuba normalization as a starting point and rebuild relationship. So I really hope tomorrow will be a new opportunity, because so far we haven't seen any concrete change, and it's very urgent to see changes. I can't hear you, Geoff. I think you have a mute.
Sorry, I think I know technology and I don't always, or at least this level of technology and I don't always. So thanks, Elena. I think that's a great summary of the report and the way it focuses on the embargo, on the human faces of the suffering that people experience, on the way that's intensified under sanctions renewed by the Trump, deepened by the Trump administration, and especially kind of looking at the differentiated impact that those sanctions have on women, on other vulnerable populations, on the emerging private sector in Cuba. And, as you said, I think the video, which I believe we're now going to be able to see, kind of gives that a very specific face. So let's see if we can do the video. I don't know if we're going to be able to get it here. Let's technology is always a challenge here. Elena, let's go back to you and see if we can get this for the end. I mean, you kind of focused in the report in general. You focused on the report in general, why now, what it highlights, the human faces. I know that Oxfam in Cuba has worked for years on gender inequality issues, on women's issues. Do you want to talk a little more specifically about what the study about your work on that, and then what the study shows about the impact on women of U.S. sanctions and the changes in recent years? Whoops. Okay.
Okay, the video.
Maybe so.
La mujer cubana ha sido una mujer muy luchadora. Va a la calle y va pensando que lleva para la casa.
Junto a mi hermana y mi mamá llegamos a este negocio familiar, Zulu.
Zulu fue creado alrededor del año 1992. Nosotros decidimos que nos hacía falta incorporar otras actividades para ayudar a nuestra economía.
Todo surgió a partir de los materiales que teníamos y las ganas de crear. Un bolso que, por supuesto, a la mujer cubana de los 90 y de hoy le sigue funcionando muchísimo. El bolso Zulu representa precisamente lo cubano, por la durabilidad y la resistencia con que realmente tratamos de hacer y crear. Las afectaciones de las medidas de Trump al negocio ha incidido de forma directa porque han afectado la entrada al país de materia prima. Nos afectan tanto en la entrada de turismo, que son nuestros clientes potenciales, como la adquisición de materiales como la piel, los hilos, los herrajes, en fin, todos los materiales con que regularmente trabajamos.
Eso que los políticos dicen que nada más que se afecta al gobierno de Cuba es falso. Realmente nos afecta a todos.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to be able at the end to put the links to the video up so people can look at it subsequently. We have a couple requests for that, and I think that does kind of encapsulate what you've been talking about, Elena. But do you want to kind of summarize on Oxfam's work on gender issues and the impact of sanctions on women in Cuba?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm happy we've been able to share the video, but it will be great to share the links as well. But yes, why to focus on women and how the blockade, how the embargo affects women is also because Oxfam work in Cuba has been focusing especially on women's rights and gender justice, fighting different forms of gender-based violence and promoting the economic empowerment and leadership of women. together with local actors, activists, and academic centers and civil society organizations and so on. And mainly also working on the communication processes and campaigns in order to transform social imaginaries that reinforce sexist and patriarchal violences, because we have to recognize that patriarchy and the patriarchal culture affects women. And why then this has been linked to the embargo, to the US sanctions, is because we witnessed how these reality are worsened by the US policy, reinforcing the pre-existing gender gaps. So what we have been doing is to look at the differentiated impacts that differentiated in the meaning that everyone feels and suffer impacts in a different way, looking at their position, the way they live and so on. So women are the most affected since they're the center of the family, and their vulnerability exposes to and affects other member families' vulnerabilities, right? So the differentiated impact that we have seen them through all the sectors of the Cuban society, because women are recognized and best represented in some sector, as I said before, in the health, education, and mostly in the caregiving processes, let's say in the family and schools and hospitals and so on, but also in the private sectors, non-state sectors, and the agricultural one. And it's important to look at how, the concrete, the actual impacts, quantifiable impacts, but also the non-quantifiable one. As I said, the collective stress that almost six decades of sanctions have given to women that need, they play this role of provider and caregiver within the family. Thanks to a study and analysis that we have developed just before this paper, published this paper, we looked at women working as caregiver. They dedicate about 35 hours weekly for the sustainability of their house and their family. So the blockade creates shortages, and these shortages are a constant stress for the Cuban people in their daily lives, and not only in the personal and family life, but also in their public and professional life. Because they feel they're limited, they experience challenges with transportation, for example, the use of obsolete technologies, computers and so on, cell phone, the access to information and training and knowledge. Zoom, for example, is one of the digital platforms that are prohibited or limited the access to. So the report aims to realistically explain that Cuban women continue to be subjected to this harsh and unequal patriarchal system, but that the blockade deepens the dependencies on the role of their pair male. And these sanctions reproduce the same logic, the patriarchal and colonialist system that increase gender inequalities instead of decreasing them. So we have experienced on the ground how the blockade affects women and how these measures reproduce and deepen and reinforce the power dynamics as the patriarchal culture, ignoring and making invisible the differentiated needs of women and their potential opportunities and autonomy. We have to consider that 78% of women and girls in Cuba were born under the blockade. So is a huge number, and the implications are also quite important. I just want to close quoting a journalist that is being interviewed during the elaboration of this paper, Lirienza Gordillo, who affirms that the blockade does not generate gender inequalities that are sustained in a patriarchal society through sexist structures, practices, relationship, and imaginary, but it does accentuate them, deepen them, making the roles assumed by women more difficult, such as for the traditionally recognized task related to the reproduction of life. So I think, yes, the US blockade could be compared to this patriarchal system, and is a even more one reason more to raise our voices and hope and fight for a change of this policy as soon as possible.
Great. Thank you, Elena. And the report is available in detail for everybody to read. And I think this video and another one we'll see shortly, both will be available as well. So I think they really make that point about the about the effect of sanctions on the Cuban population in general and their disproportionate effect on women in the context of a traditional and patriarchal society that needs its own internal sets of changes and movements. So thanks again. Let's turn now to Connor. Connor, as I mentioned, is a journalist who's worked and lived in Havana for many years, edits the MEDICC Review, which looks at health and science issues in Cuba. Connor, do you want to take a minute and talk about U.S. sanctions and their impact on health and medical sectors in Cuba, especially today in the context of the pandemic? You're still muted.
Hey, okay, Zoom.
There we go.
Zoom JB here. Okay, thanks for having me today. I want to put it into context, these sanctions, just so folks can understand how comprehensive they are. When they were put in place in 1960 under Dwight D. Eisenhower, I quote, "Every possible means should be undertaken to bring about hunger and desperation." In 1960, fast forward, 1992, Cuban Democracy Act, the CIA found that food shortages and distribution problems have caused malnutrition and disease. Fast forward once again to 2019, and Mike Pompeo says, quote, "Our goal is to starve the island," unquote. And here we are in 2021, full-on global pandemic. These sanctions are still in place. Of course, any policy designed to starve a nation is going to affect health. We see that in three major areas. One is acute shortage of medicines, everything from ibuprofen, low-dose aspirin for cardiovascular patients, HIV antiretrovirals, hormone therapies for the National Transgender Health Program, medicines for chronic diseases, including Alzheimer's, hypertension. So this is affecting the most vulnerable. It's affecting seniors, it's affecting the chronically ill, it's affecting LGBTQ Cubans. And so the shortage of medicines is real. This is affecting physical and mental health. In Cuba, there's a holistic view of health that includes spiritual, mental, physical health. And there are folks that say, well, Cuba should just buy elsewhere, just buy the medicines elsewhere. The problem is that this network of laws, of these sanctions, present barriers, it codifies barriers for Cuba to access international financial institutions, international shipping possibilities. So it's not even a problem that Cuba can throw money at if they had any money, because these barriers are quite real. The second area that it affects is the production capacity. Folks say Cuba's got this robust biotechnology sector that since the 1980s has produced vaccines and therapies and medicines. And so why don't they just produce it domestically? Again, the access to international financial institutions and shipping. How do you get the raw materials? How do you get the inputs to guarantee these medicines for your universal health system? They've got the manufacturing plants, they've got the know-how, they've got the regulatory authorities. But as the biotechnology sector grew stronger and obtained World Health Organization certification and all of these mechanisms that in international health are necessary, the sanctions also were strengthened. So that's another area that it affects, and it shuts down collaboration and scientific exchange between the US and Cuba. And so as a journalist, MEDICC Review has a section called Cuban Women of Science. And I've personally interviewed Dr. Tanya Crombay, who is the clinical director at the Center for Molecular Immunology, Dr. Beatriz Macheco, who is the director of the National Medical Genetics Center, Dr. Amayalid Arteaga, who's director of the Clinical Trial Center, and most recently, Dr. Dagmar Garcia, who led up the vaccine development, COVID-19 vaccine development for the Finlay Institute. All of these women talk to me about the professional development that is limited, that science is limited, that the collaboration with US scientists and colleagues are limited by these sanctions. It's limiting scientific innovation when you cut off that kind of collaboration, that two-way collaboration. Nevertheless, Cuba has developed 5 COVID vaccines for the regular vaccine for COVID-19, for pediatric Cubans, and also for convalescent Cubans who have had COVID. And so it was announced yesterday, the first results, that the Abdala vaccine is 92% effective, and over 2 million Cubans have been vaccinated, and that vaccine rollout is also affected by these sanctions. And what we're seeing with these nearly 200 strengthened measures that were taken under the Trump administration, it's like a double whammy. We've got a global pandemic plus strengthened sanctions. And again, for context, I'll just mention that 71% of health professionals in Cuba are women. Women head the scientific research teams. Women are heading the vaccine rollout. There's a woman heads the clinical trials center. There are also mothers, as Elena mentioned, mothers, heads of household, caregivers. And so these sanctions affect them as well. And under the pandemic, and more of this is elaborated in the Oxfam report, The Human Face. I mean, I always say that the best people to talk about the situation in Cuba are Cubans in Cuba. And so that the report is chock full of that. It's really hard to transmit the difficulties and the struggle that Cuban and Cuban women specifically are facing today, the chronic shortage of food, medicine, and hygiene products in the midst of a global pandemic. There's increased pressure on financial institutions, international institutions to not do business with Cuba. There are multi-million-dollar fines being levied against companies that do business with Cuba, and Western Union was shut down. And so that affects the purchasing power of Cuban families. Again, here we are in 2021, and the same exact sanctions that were put in place by the Trump administration during the global pandemic are valid and ongoing. They're the same as they were 2 years ago. So the other thing is that let's not put everything at the feet of the embargo. There's a global recession. Cuba's GDP fell by 11% last year. There are internal problems. I live them, I know them. They're worse than everyone really knows. And so it's not all at the feet of the embargo, but these sanctions limit development and limit the health that might be realized were they not under these sanctions. Further scientific advancement and professional development and innovation is limited. Zoom, no virtual conferences for Cuban scientists with their colleagues around the world. And the US Embassy is closed, which happened before COVID. I think it's very important to point that out. And so that limits, you can't get visas to go to conferences in the United States and have scientific exchange with colleagues. And last but not least, it's the COVID rollout. Excuse me. The vaccine rollout, the COVID response, these sanctions just cripple the possibilities that Cuba might have. There are 30 million, for instance, there are 30 million syringes short for whole vaccine population. They've got the vaccines, but they need the syringes. So there has been a worldwide civil society campaign to donate 30 million syringes to Cuba. And all of these hurdles, how do we ship them? How do we get them to Cuba so that they can effectively roll out their vaccine campaign? It interferes with the financing, purchasing and shipping PPE, ventilators, syringes, cotton swabs. All of this is limited by these codified sanctions. And what does that look like today? I'm going to share a story of my young friend, Dianelis. Dianelis lost her job in a private cafeteria when COVID hit. She lost her daycare for her 2-year-old son because daycare was prioritized for frontline workers. She has not had a remittance from her uncle, who sends $100 every couple of months. So she has less money, less opportunity, and she has to find food for her 2-year-old every day. Last week, she left at 7 a.m. to stand online at a store, find anything that they might have to sell. She was lucky they had chicken for sale. She stood online for 8 hours. This is not online in an air-conditioned store. You're outside, you might be under the sun. And 8 hours went by. She was approaching the door. The manager came out. All the chicken was sold out. So she went home empty-handed. She will have to face that same kind of challenge the next day and every day thereafter. Dianelis was born under the embargo. Her mother was born under the embargo. Her 2-year-old son was born under the embargo. And her story is the story of my local family doctor, the local pharmacist, the head of the vaccine team. Cuban women every day for 60 years have been limited by this policy to starve and deprive the nation. So sanctions punish frontline workers trying to contain COVID-19 and vaccine the population. Sanctions punish science. They penalize scientists, and they punish mothers, children, elders, the most vulnerable. And one thing I'd just like to point out is that in 2018, the Security Council of the UN passed Resolution 2417 unanimously, which condemns the deliberate deprivation of food in conflict situations. And so these sanctions also do grave damage to the image of the United States around the world. What kind of bully would strengthen sanctions during a global pandemic? It is unconscionable, and to mirror what Representative McGovern said, it's immoral. It's also impractical. And so I don't want to give it clearly, not all fault is at the feet of the embargo. Can Cuba do more? Yes. Can Cuba do better? Yes, but so can the United States. This is not the first or the last or the worst pandemic that we're going to face. We have to look for areas of cooperation, collaboration, despite differing views. This might be something that we could employ in the United States as well. We are under a health threat, and we have to work together to solve it. And we need to find just and equitable frameworks to guarantee health for all. The current administration has a chance to turn the corner on this policy of creating hunger and desperation. And the US legacy moving forward, I don't think should be one of creating hunger and desperation. It should be of cooperation and finding mutually advantageous areas like science, like health. I think we're in a moment right now where the evidence base and science is where we should be looking for answers to this global health pandemic. And Cuba is, frankly, just to sum up, it's under a double pandemic. It is under these strengthened sanctions and also COVID. And so, you know, it's a very, I get a little bit upset. I start thinking about all the people and how they are that human face of the sanctions that we don't see often enough. And I really applaud Oxfam for putting out this report right now. And I always say that, you know, don't listen to me. Listen to Cubans who are living on the island. They can tell you how this policy penalizes them and there's a terrific video that we're going to see that addresses just that. If we can see the video from a young Cuban cooperative farmer who is doing everything she can to produce food during COVID-19.
Las mujeres tenemos y desarrollamos todos los días una capacidad inventiva y una capacidad de resiliencia y de adaptación a los cambios que tenemos que enfrentar. Desde mis inicios laborales estoy vinculada en el sector agropecuario. Tienes que poner una manguera, poner un pedazo de cóctel, un pedazo de nylon, lo vuelve a unir y aún así mira la fuga de agua que tenemos. La agricultura lleva un deterioro continuo y junto con ella incluso un deterioro del medio ambiente. Es uno de los sectores más golpeados por el bloqueo. Comercializar con los países de América Latina siendo un mercado tan cercano se nos hace imposible prácticamente debido a la característica extraterritorial que tiene el bloqueo. Si no existiera el bloqueo, el índice de productividad y el índice de rendimiento aumentaría. La economía no solo se afecta a nivel nacional, afecta a nivel personal cada una de las casas donde vivimos. Tengo 31 años y hace 60 años vivimos bajo las injustas leyes que nos impone un bloqueo que intenta asfixiarnos.
Thank you, Connor. That was really a great presentation and a great video from Oxfam. Again, I think those videos will all be available for people to look at and download subsequently. Let's turn now to María Isabel to talk about specifically sort of from the perspective of a Cuban American, from the perspective of the Cuban American community here, how you see the impact of the Trump sanctions, the embargo in general, in the context of the pandemic and its impact, the concerns of Cuban Americans and its impact on Cuban families. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geoff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, let me start by saying that I'm not speaking on behalf of all Cuban Americans. I'm just here on behalf of CAFE, Cuban Americans for Engagement. But I do think that the embargo is an obsolete policy that has to go. And the surveys, the polls show that the majority of Cuban Americans and Americans repel the embargo. They want the embargo to end. So in that sense, I feel confident and I feel that I'm doing a good service to my community by coming here and express my opinions on behalf of that majority that wants the embargo to end. So the sanctions have an undeniable physical, palpable impact and also a psychological one on our communities. Specifically, the sanctions that are hitting the hardest are the inability to send remittances via Western Union, the closing of the embassies, the canceling of traveling to provinces, the halt on the Cuban parole program, as others have mentioned. As in the case of most immigrant communities, the Cuban American community remains in close contact with relatives and friends that we left behind when we leave our country. And that relates to the notion of extended family, which is central to the Latin American identity, to the Cuban identity, to the Caribbean identity. So we're not different from others. Our concept of family is larger than that of the traditional immediate family. So the dynamics that take place between Cubans and Cuban Americans are rooted in this concept of extended family, which explains these extended support networks that exist between these two communities. By the way, the Americans are included also in this. I know many Americans that have been traveling to Cuba for a long time, and they always stay in the same house, in the same casa particular, with the same family. And for them, these people are not just their Cuban friends, but their Cuban family. So I guess this is a contagious effect of the extended family concept. Remittances are a key feature of this structure of support. They help to alleviate the terrible conditions of our relatives on the island. But as Elena also mentioned, they're also the main source of funding for private businesses, for private initiatives. So the private business, the private sector and the families also are impacted. In September 2019, the Trump administration capped the remittances to $1,000 per quarter per person, with the additional condition that the money had to be sent to a close relative. And I always remember when sending money through Western Union, having to check on the box that says that the person that you're sending money is not a member of the Communist Party. So it's kind of a surreal scenario. So considering that many immigrants support more than one family member, it is clear that this measure affects not only individuals, but also these extended family units that I was making reference to. Then we have the case with the creation of this restricted entities, list of restricted entities that led to the closure of Western Union service in Cuba. So this has had a total disruptive effect on these networks of support in the middle of the pandemic. That, as I said, it is not only established between Cuban and Cuban Americans families, but also between Americans and Cubans on the island. Women, of course, are, as the report says, as my colleagues have explained, these sanctions have an amplified effect on women. As Elena and Connor say, women occupy both a big percentage of the private and the public spaces, and they are carrying all this burden. In addition to this, there is also there is also the psychological, emotional impact on both communities of the sanctions. Most of us came to the US, most of the Cuban Americans that I know, for better opportunities, even looking for freedom. However, in the process of achieving that, a process for which we feel very grateful, and we also acknowledge our privileged status in this area. In the process of doing that, we encounter that we cannot always travel to our country of origin because of travel restrictions. We are told who is part of our family and who is not. Remember Bush times when you could only travel to Cuba if you had an immediate family. So we are told when we can see them, how much money we can send, when we can send it. So in my case, and I think in the case of my compatriotas, Cuban Americans, the emotional impact of seeing our family ties sever is immeasurable, regardless of our ideology. The anxiety that this creates is huge. We are a community that is traumatized by being caught up between two governments at odds, and the sanctions are a big part of that trauma. You can imagine also that the trauma is huge for Cubans on the island, because at least we're here, we can travel, but it's more difficult for them to come to see us. In my case, my family, my tia, my aunt Isabel lives in Havana. She's 85, and my father, who is 88, lives in Miami. During the 26 years that we have lived in the US, they have only seen each other 4 times or 5 times maybe. 5 times maybe. And every time we speak to her on the phone, or every time when I have seen her in Havana, she cries, because she doesn't know when is the next time that she's going to be able to see her brother. I went to Cuba in 2015 during the Obama years, and then I was making a documentary at that time, so I went to interview Cubans for my documentary. Later, I went in 2018 during the Trump years, at the beginning of the Trump administration, and with my students as part of a class that I was teaching. We had this summer travel to Cuba. And it was like visiting 2 different countries. In 2015, the paladares, casas particulares, the businesses, the private initiatives were thriving. The proliferation of not small businesses, but private restaurants, Airbnbs was very noticeable. 3 years later, the situation was completely different. On the first day, we visited a private paladar, a privately owned restaurant, and when the restaurant was practically empty. When I left, I say goodbye to the owner, who was looking very sad and depressed because he had explained that how during the Trump years the restaurant was full. And so he looked at me and he said, "La cosa está fea. Things are looking pretty ugly." This was a few years back. And we can imagine how he's doing now. And he also said, at least back then we had hope. So again, the emotional toll on families is hard to measure. The fact that these sanctions have been tightened in the midst of a pandemic, as Connor said, it's horrible. It contributes even more to this greater painful sense of isolation, disconnection from our family, sense of disempowerment that we feel.
Thank you, Isabel. I was going to pose another sort of final question to you, because the Biden administration has talked about framing its approach toward Cuba around Cuban Americans as the best ambassadors for our values, and around human rights for the Cuban people. And if really quickly, because I know we're tight on time here, you want to comment on kind of where the current sanctions policy is and what it means in relation to what the Biden administration has said its goals are.
Right. Yeah, the idea that the policy approach to Cuba should be based on human rights promotion, and the fact that we are good ambassadors. I think most of us, we agree on that. We believe that that is a good policy. However, I would like to add a few items that are usually missing from that narrative. First, one element to consider is that promoting a set of human rights by eliminating other set of human rights is not a good policy. For example, limiting people-to-people travel to secure more human rights observance, it's not a good way to go, because it promotes an environment of hostility and isolation that enables even more human rights violations. The elimination of remittances, of course. Also, we also should I believe that human rights should be promoted on their own merit, on a one-by-one basis. This means that we should look for to build a constructive environment for the dialogue, and that entails recognizing areas of progress on the Cuban side, giving visibility to areas of improvement. There are many things to criticize about the Cuban government. I was going through the chat, and there's one person, and that gives me the reason that that we view is not on the majority, that keeps saying that the violation of human rights. Yes, we agree that there are violations that the Cuban government needs to address and to improve, but there are also areas that have been in which they have been making progress that the governments could use as a leverage, as a way to find points to initiate a productive dialogue. Health in the Sinovac vaccine that is produced by the Centro de Inmunología and the Roswell Park, the Roswell Park Institute sponsored the clinical trial. Areas, for example, in the economic reform, the pymes, the pequeñas y medianas empresas, the small businesses legal frame has been approved. Many other things in terms of religion of freedom. Those are things that deserve to be on the headlines once in a while, so that there is also a good a willingness to negotiate and to talk. We also believe that conceiving human rights in a narrow way that only worries about the political freedoms is not productive. We at CAFE have criticized, as I said, crackdown on the dissidents, the national TV campaigns to discredit the opposition, the arbitrary detentions. I have written about that. But compromising access of a majority of Cubans to food and medicine to bring more political freedoms to those who want a change of government is not only misguided, it also defeats the original purpose of a comprehensive and more coherent human rights policy approach that cares for all. So, and also not everybody in Cuba is a dissident. There are people that are still with the government, that they have, or maybe they want a change of government, but they don't feel that they have a leader in the opposition, and they just don't want change. They don't want another revolution. They don't want a bloodbath, and they have the rights also to be heard. So regarding yes, we couldn't agree more that we are good ambassadors. Cubans Cuban Americans and Americans. But again, the Trump sanctions is preventing us from moving in that direction. So the elimination of the restrictions in place would be a first step to take to find this common ground that would allow us to exert, our role as good ambassadors.
Great. Thank you, Isabel. Thanks to all our panelists. We're formally out of time, but I think if people can stay on a few more minutes, I really want to give each of the panelists the chance to say a last word. We have had a lot of questions. We had a number of lengthy inputs in the chat, some of them ending with vulgarities. We actually, in the comments, in the question and answer section, we have a lot of good questions. We're not, unfortunately, going to be able to get to all of them. Several people suggested other resources on women in Cuba and other kind of materials that people might want to look at. There's some good questions and some good comments about how you frame some of the discussion. But what I want to do is wind up here and ask each of our, we had a lot of questions about what we can do to support Cuban women, to as Cuban Americans and as other activists to help change policy and open political space and space for against to reduce or eliminate U.S. sanctions. I wonder if each of you would like to say a last really brief word of that about that, and then I'll just wrap up really quickly and say something about executive action and legislative initiatives in the United States and what people might do here next. So, Elena, let me turn to you quickly for like a minute or so.
Thank you, Geoff. Yes, I've seen the several questions and I'm very happy we have received so many questions, and thank you for all the panelists and yourself for the presentation. I think it's very insightful for someone who lives and works in Cuba together with Cuban women and men daily, and share as a woman, as a mother, all the challenges that we experience in Cuba. Just to answer briefly to one of the questions, we work with the Federation of Mujeres Cubanas, and this organization is actually working, participating to several projects, supporting economic empowerment, mainly in rural women, mainly in rural spaces. But there are also other organizations that sometimes, we focus on the mainstream ones, as we can define the Federación Mujeres Cubanas, but there are so many other organizations that we work with as Oxfam, that the international community supports, like Galfisa or SEMLIKE or the Paloma Project, but there are so many. So for those that are interested, it's important to look at the variety that are and is existing in Cuba to support women in women's rights and gender justice, even more now when the family code is going to be, under discussion. So it's very important. Well, and let me just say how we can, as an international community, how we can, support this changing in policies. Maybe, the name of the campaign has to change more than ever, has to change the narrative. The blockade, the embargo, the restrictions, the sanctions are affecting the lives of women and men in Cuba and their families abroad, as we can see. So the narrative have to move from how to impact the government and the economy to how these 60 years have actually, affected the lives of these people, and even more now after more than 1 year of health crisis. So what we can do is to advocate firmly and persistently to lift this sanction and expand exchanges and share the testimonies and the evidences we have on how this policy is actually affecting the people living in Cuba and abroad. I think this is my last key message.
Great, thank you, Elena. That's great and a brief summary, and I recommend everybody to download and look at the Oxfam report. Connor, you want to say a very brief word on the next steps and what you think would be useful to do?
Sure. I think everyone in the United States is maybe not everyone, but a majority of us are tired of the politicization of health and science. We have to, as Elena said, we have to go to the evidence base and opening up scientific exchange and collaboration, which entails lifting executive orders that limit these collaborations, allowing Cuban scientists and health professionals to get visas, allowing US scientists to be able to come to Cuba, have knowledge transfer, spurring scientific innovation. This will help US patients as well as Cuban. And so again, looking for those mutually advantageous areas that will benefit both populations is very important. And as everyone is saying, this is an antiquated policy. It hasn't worked, and it's time to try a new tact. And with that new tact, recognize how these sanctions have limited the rights of Cubans, the most vulnerable Cubans. And again, I'm so glad Elena mentioned the family code. Cuba's behind on a lot of things. We recognize that. There is no gay marriage. There is no gay adoption, and all of the rights that go with legally binding same-sex unions. But to get to that, we need to, I think, we need to encourage collaboration and cooperation between the two countries. And lifting those executive orders is something that can be done. We saw it under Obama. We have the evidence of what happened when things were loosened up. And so normalization has proven to be more effective for the goals of US policy. So why don't we try that?
Thank you very much. That's a great way to wrap up. Maria, Isabel, a last word?
Yes, I will mention a few items that I had on my previous answer. I think there are practical things that can be done by executive action, and Western Union is the most important one, I would say. Even besides all the changes with the dollar in Cuba, we need to open remittances so the Cuban families have a relief. The situation is really critical for them. Reopening consular services would be also something that we could do. It could take more time, but a fully functioning embassy is essential to pursuing U.S. interest relation with Cuba, and it also could avert a crisis. We have seen so many people that are crossing the streets, the Florida Straits lately interdicted by the Coast Guard, and I think it's about 200 now only in this year. Also, restoring the parole reunification program could help in this sense. Traveling, of course, lifting the restrictions for people-to-people, issuing the general license again for people-to-people travel, which is a best way to empower us as best ambassadors in this area of traveling that has been seriously compromised under the Trump administration, and which honestly we still don't know why we are working with this policy that is designed by the Trump administration. So a change in those practical things could be beneficial for the Cuban people, for the Cuban families. Also, the travel to provinces, it is very difficult for people that want to travel to Oriente, to Central Cuba, because there's no direct flights to those provinces. That would be essential also. It is in the best interest of the Biden administration to reverse these policies and to promote more traveling. And on an anecdotal note, I would say that I recently saw a famous dissident saying in a panel that people-to-people travel doesn't work because the Cuban government controls the travels and the state security, they have total control, and it's not true. I took my students to Cuba in 2018, and I designed the trip. I didn't have to go through any special agency to do it. I contacted my ex-professors from the University of Havana, cuentapropistas, entrepreneurs, and they came to give lectures to the students at a Hotel Sevilla. I rented the space. They came, nobody there from the government went. Mark Fran also visited us, and it was a wonderful experience. And we didn't, I'm not saying that it's the same case for everyone, but it is this myth that Cuba is North Korea and the traveling to Cuba is dangerous and we're gonna be sequestered by the government. It's not true. So if the administration is limiting going in this direction because of that fear, it is not true. It's time to change that mentality. There's one person in the chat that asked about ways to, how can we help to oppose embargo? Cuban Americans for Engagement is a platform. And I think, Samantha, you are the one who asked the questions. We're already in contact, but for all of those who want to work with us, we're organizing trips to Washington, virtual trips to meet with congressmen, with the State Department, to make our voices heard. So please contact us. We have a website and a Facebook page, and we are there for you if you want to join us on this effort.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just wrap up by thanking all of our panelists. I want to remind everybody that WOLA and CDA issued a report early this year, and one of the about a roadmap toward better relations with Cuba, better relations that are in our interest as well as in the interest of the Cuban people themselves. That report emphasizes that President Biden could return to the Obama era approach toward Cuba with the stroke of a pen, with one reversal, with one single executive order. I recommend people take a look at that report, as well as to take a look at the Oxfam report, some of the other things that are in the chat, the videos that we have available. I think Representative McGovern made the case early on that we need to make more noise, and the Biden administration needs to hear more from all of us. I want to urge everybody to do that. I think particularly for people in the Cuban American community, reaching out to CAFE and to others about doing that is important. I think the resources we all have here are important in doing that. And I guess I'd just finally say there's general agreement that the US, in its own interest and the interest of the Cuban people, ought to lift the embargo, ought to re-engage with Cuba, and in that process, engage in cooperation as well as dialogue about a range of issues where we have real disagreements. If you ask a tiered series of steps that the Biden administration ought to take and that the Congress ought to take, I think it's really clear that allowing unrestricted remittances for Cuban families is key. I think it's really clear that enabling scientific cooperation, particularly in the context and the aftermath of the pandemic, is key, and that requires, as do a number of other things, restoring consular services at our embassy so that back and forth dialogue and exchange can take place. I think it's really clear that executive action to reopen travel that benefits not only Cuban families and Cuban Americans and their relatives, but helps support the Cuban economy, and particularly the private sector, the civil society sectors that are emerging, the nonprofit community, and all of that in Cuba itself. Beyond that, those are clearly urgent priorities the Biden administration ought to take on its own initiative. Beyond that, there are broader steps on travel, on exchange, on engagement. I would urge everybody to take a look at the two bills currently in the Senate, one by Senator Wyden and Senator Leahy, called the Cuba Trade Act of 2021, one by Senator Klobuchar and Senator Moran, a bipartisan bill, the Freedom to Export to Cuba Act. Both of them take comprehensive steps to end the embargo. And if we don't expect that to happen overnight, I think the public call for that is extremely important to help allow the Biden administration to see there is public interest, there is public support, there ought to be a push on their part toward greater re-engagement. So I urge people to take a look at that legislation, as well as to think about ways you can directly reach out to your members of Congress and to the Biden administration. And I will wrap up with that. I want to thank everybody for staying on through this presentation. I want to congratulate Oxfam on the report and everybody involved in this effort. So thank you all, and we'll stay in touch.